So the deal is very simple. After the whole, running through the whole thing, right? You may have something either to say to each other, or something unsaid, or something you feel you change your mind, or whatsoever. So whatever you want to say. So we'll keep it, roundtable format is always open-ended, but the first round of the conversation may be shorter, 5 minutes or at most 10-minute intervention. Then we open, yes? Or the conversation could go on here, then we will move. So that's the idea of this one. And the next roundtable is designed for those who actually are supposed to be our younger generation, slightly younger, to take up what they have heard in the process. So in other words, to keep both the audience and also all of us want to have something to say, right? And also can be the continuity of morning or yesterday discussion, yes? So we'll start. So any one of you want to kick out, yeah? Sam, you want to say something? Yeah. Oh, so we can go this way.
Okay. When you say reflection, it puts a big burden on on one to think in a larger sense. But I have two things. One thing that speaking from an Africa perspective, one thing that I feel that we could have been discussing a bit more when we pose the idea of a scramble, and we think that we talked a lot about China, not much about India in Africa, and almost nothing about... Hello? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was just saying that one thing that is missing, when we follow through Bandung into the non-aligned movement and all the developments around South-South cooperation and so forth, less prominent in our discussion, we focused on China, but less prominent was India. From an Africa perspective, Brazil, Singapore, even a little bit of Malaysia, the semi-peripheries, these Jomo, there are many more actors involved who constitute the new idea of South-South, but it's really a business has evolved into a huge kind of a scramble, but with different styles and approaches of business. So this kind of investment, I believe that even in Latin America, if you think about it, the larger countries, and so that if we're thinking of a future of a Bandung, of the South, the dynamics of these sort of emerging powers or the semi-peripheries within the set of countries that would constitute this are much more complicated, and we need to think about it. I would also point out that there are other dynamics also. For instance, a couple of years ago, we were reading about the US striking arrangements with India to do some investments and in Africa on agricultural transformation, seeing that the agricultural, the agrarian question is one of the biggest problems underlying the kind of poverty issues and hunger that Jomo was talking about. You have Japan, for instance, teaming up with Brazil in one of the biggest land grabs in Africa, in Mozambique. So the complexity of the interactions and so forth, this is something that we need to think about the set of countries in a broader way. I think that on the question of decolonization, I always saw Codesria, this organization that we worked for with the Pan-African perspective, as being a liberation struggle, an intellectual struggle. Most of us saw ourselves as part of a movement to debunk certain ways in which some of the disciplines, anthropology in particular, history, and even the sort of dominant social science, the paradigms, neo-patrimonialism, how do we take this forward? And it's very interesting when we listen to, say, the way the presentation on China and the whole conceptualization of revolutions, what is possible and so forth. And so I think that there's still a lot more that we can do in the future in terms of that aspect of intellectual exchange, seeing that most of us know very little about each other's countries, but seeing that also we are getting a more complex set of interactions among this group of countries that form the Bandung group, or if you like. Thank you.
Well, to respond to you, no other territory has the reach of China. And therefore, you don't speak of Brazil in the same light, because it doesn't have that reach, it doesn't have that focus, that spread, it doesn't have that long-term strategic view. So whilst I do not necessarily agree with the word scramble, because it's associated with the late 19th century carving up of Africa, but to some extent there is a kind of carving up that is taking place, which you are referring to. So my only disagreement with you concerns the vast gap between China and the rest of the other countries that you identify. Although they are all there and they're important, and we're not forgetting the traditional countries from Europe and the United States who continue to have considerable impact. But I wanted to add to the issue that you raised and to ask the question, who wants to be third world? Who wants to be third world? I'm just asking the question to the panel and then to the audience, because the Bangladesh, the Bandung 55 was premised on the notion that we all share common levels of poverty, experience of colonial rule, and therefore as poor countries we are coming together. But some of the countries from the Bandung are no longer poor, and therefore to what extent is the concept of the third world a useful concept, or is the concept that we are all basically running away from?
Thank you. You know, in these days, the newspapers in Montevideo are very worried with an issue, which is our drinkable water. All of a sudden, the water coming through the tap is not drinkable anymore. It has bad taste, bad smell. Now the blame is on China. And actually there is some reason for that, because the water comes from a river that in the last 10 years there has been a complete change in the agricultural production. Soybeans are like an invasion, and from something that we didn't know what it was. 15 years ago, nobody had ever seen a soybean in my country, and now half of the agricultural land is planted with soybeans that are genetically modified, that use so much pesticides that are not useful for human consumption, but they all go to China to feed the pigs and the chicken, because the diet in China is changing and people have more conditions and eat more And then, of course, all those pesticides and fertilizers and so on end up in the river, and the water we drink is not good anymore. Of course, the other side of the equation is that the country has an economic boom because of all the high price that is being paid, soybeans and so on. The other news is that the price of soybeans has fallen from $600 per ton to $300 per ton. The producers still make a lot of money. They made much more money if it is 600, but they still make money with $300 per ton because they have a very cheap cost and because nobody works there. It's planes fumigating the fields and highly mechanized, so on. Who is to blame for that? Because that puts the whole economy of the country in crisis. China, because of the slowdown. But then we asked the economists, and they said, well, there is a slowdown, but Chinese demand is still growing because it still grows. So why is the price coming down? Well, because we don't really sell the soybeans to China. The soybeans go to China, but we sell them to the Chicago Stock Exchange, and the Chicago Stock Exchange sells them to China. And it is the speculation related to the economic policies of the Federal Reserve of the US and the people that invest, the funds, and so on, that determine the price. Which is completely absurd, both for China and for Uruguay. The question is, if there was, or if there is, any sense of third world solidarity and of doing things different than the old dependency, exporting of commodities and importing of manufactured products, which is what we import from China. All the new cars are now Chinese. Why can't we establish a state-to-state negotiation and say, we sell the soybeans to you, you pay us in yuan renminbi, we pay your cars in yuan renminbi, why use dollars, why be at the mercy of the speculation in the Chicago Stock Exchange, which ends up favoring a series of highly financial intermediaries and so on. And that happens, I imagine, all around the world in the relations, not just with a small country like Uruguay, but with other countries and the rest of the third world. I do think that there is still a notion, a concept, and a mutual benefit in third world solidarity and in doing things differently. But we need to have the courage to do so.
Thank you. I wonder where this word scramble came from. I don't know, but I won't be surprised at all if its ownership is with those who had been in control of the situation of African markets, etc., 20, 30 years ago. When I teach economic history to my students, which I sometimes do, I explain to them that every time established monopolies were shaken up, it's good for us. So I tell them when the Japanese came in and undercut the British monopoly in the colonial period and set up textile industries, that was the beginning of textile industry in East Africa. So I personally think that the breakup of British, American, etc. monopolies with the Chinese coming in is a great thing. I mean, I have no doubt about it, you know. That doesn't mean I buy the idea that we have the same interest. Okay, I do agree with you that we're no longer in the same structural position as we were in 60 years ago. China is an emerging global power now. You know, just as we had to rethink our relationship to nationalism after independence, not just debunking it, but sort of understanding a nuanced way of dealing with this force. Similarly, I think we'll have to sort of think our relationship with an emerging global power in that same manner. I mean, it's changing. So what is the change? Without buying this powerful media machine from the West, right? The news scramble. It's not a news scramble, okay? I mean, it's there's something new, but what is it? We have to figure it out. The African governments have learned some lessons from the Cold War. One lesson they've learned is don't choose one side. You play both. You play both. So you know, you look at the Uganda government. It's completely embedded with the Americans in the war on terror, but has very close relations with China when it comes to economic relationships. Look at Ethiopia. Most African governments are going this way. You know, they're not saying either or. No, those days are gone. That naivete is not there anymore. So that's one issue. Second thing is that that's the official level. But now this level, us, we're not governments. Some of us may like to be in government, but we're not governments, you know. So at this level, I mean, I think we're way behind the governments. Yeah, we're way behind the governments. The idea of exploring what used to be called people-to-people relations, whether it's relations between social movements or it's relations between sort of intellectuals, scholars, it's high time. I mean, for me, this is a very exciting experience to meet colleagues, to hear, to get responses from vantage point of completely different experiences. I mean, today I had discussions, you know, Japan, Hong Kong. Wow, that's great, absolutely great. These guys I see, I mean, you know, but it's the newness, this expansion. I don't see him. So, you know, you brought Latin America here. So it's, I hope we can explore the possibilities of this popular level of engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to a question posed by Samir Amin at the end of his own opening remarks, mainly because somebody asked me about it yesterday and I failed to respond. And the question was, you know, I think he chose to characterize the Chinese situation as that of market socialism. I'm not so sure it's a market socialism. I think we basically have slow ascendance of capitalism. And it's interesting that probably China today has a larger capitalist sector proportionately compared to, say, Singapore, where almost 40% of the private of the economy continues to be controlled by the state. So this is a very different world we are living in. And Lee Kuan Yew, before he died, one of his great hopes was for Singapore to move much more into private capitalism. He claimed that the reason he had state capitalism was because of the failure of the capitalist class to emerge and to go beyond trading. I don't share the view of Lee Kuan Yew or Samir Amin, but so I think it's a bit of wishful thinking to think that somehow or other this process will emerge, will end up with market socialism and then to some kind of ostensibly superior type of socialism. Nothing like this happens on its own. And I think it is important to be realistic about prospects for change. Having said that, I do think, however, that we have capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And it is important to recognize the potential of that kind of capitalism. I think as Mahmood has just emphasized, promoting inter-capitalist competition is actually very useful because it allows those who are smaller and weaker more options, more room for maneuver, if you will. And all that is well and good. But I think I would like to go back to the question which I ended up with in my formal remarks yesterday, and that is, what about China? What will happen when you have a situation where the richest people in China are all members of the party, of the ruling party? What is the nature of that ruling party? And what are its implications in terms of policy, public policies generally, including foreign policy? And I think we have to recognize that foreign policy is not just interstate policy, which is what most people think foreign policy is about. It also involves foreign economic relations. And for those of you who have followed what has been happening over the weekend in Washington, the big game changer, as we were discussing yesterday, is the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. And already there are people in Washington where the finance ministers and central bank governors are meeting over the weekend are talking about some change. It's very unclear what is going to happen. But I think there is a very imperfect arrangement now called the BRICS. There's another very imperfect arrangement called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there are huge opportunities which China has to promote dialogue. I mentioned the G77 and China as one example, but it really has to do ultimately with how China seeks to position itself, not only in terms of its own national political project, but also in terms of the international, the world it sees as being feasible, and how it will cooperate and who it will cooperate with. And this, I think, is a question which will be very central to the feasibility of strengthened solidarity among developing countries. Developing countries made a bold commitment to supporting China, but obviously many decades ago, in welcoming China into the G77 plus China, I think everybody will agree that without the energetic efforts of developing countries, China would not have been able to take its rightful place, for example, in the United Nations and other organizations. But maybe we are not living in a sentimental world where there is much appreciation of this. So what does it actually mean as we go forward? And I still don't know the answer to those questions. Thank you.
这个九姆说他没有答案。我虽然生活在中国，我也觉得没有答案。如果有答案，我们就不会坐到这里来开会了。那问题是这个因为这次一直在讲这个中国的独特性。我如果倒回去看19世纪晚期到20世纪初那个时候的中国，在经济上还是很弱，也几乎完全没有能力能够参与这个比较主动的来介入这个国际事务。但是那个时候的中国还真是很特别，而且这个特别还不是一个，还是很大程度上它这个特别，它的这个独特性啊，是有很多好的可能性的。 中国的这个有一个20年有一个国民党的一个左翼的一个政治家，他叫廖仲恺，他说过一个很有意思的话，他说这个中国啊，一定会对世界上起很大的作用，但他说这个作用啊，如果我们对世界上不起好的作用，我们就一定是在起坏的作用，不可能不起作用。那跟那个时代相比，今天的中国很有钱，经济上好像越来越厉害。我们现在还是一个基本上是一个全球是一个资本主义的国家，资本主义的世界。所以在这样的世界上面，你有钱，有经济的力量，是可以做很多事情的。因此，现在的问题就是这样的，在中国发展起来的这样的这个经济的力量，掌握在谁手里？用这个经济的力量在世界上做什么？我觉得这个是中国人，尤其是中国的知识界，包括中国的政治人物，首先要回答的问题。这个我想也就是Jomo刚才所说的这个要回答的问题。未来的世界会是什么样？的确取决于一大批正在起来的新的经济力量，中国是一个，印度是一个，还有其他的，我估计像南美啊这些，像巴西啊这些比较大的国家，就是人多、地方大的国家。所以在这个事情上，我是觉得对中国人来说，你首先是有没有一个对于中国的未来的一个好的一个理想，而这个对未来中国的好的理想，中国应该成为什么样的一个国家，和对于未来世界应该是一个什么样的世界，这个必须要想清楚，然后在这个基础上来创造具体的社会变革、经济、政治、文化各方面的具体的这个行动路线。我觉得中国现在的情况是，经济在增长，这个中国的独特性也仍然还在，但是这个独特性当中，我个人觉得坏的东西越来越多。所以这个事情，所以我是觉得，其实这个问题是非常的迫切。我想我们今天在这里大家这样来讨论，我想也就是因为意识到这个问题，这个是我们大家共同要来回答的，但是中国的大陆自己的人，首先有责任来回答。
Thank you. Let me begin on a slightly more frivolous note, but not really frivolous. At lunchtime, I was accosted by some friends who asked what the place of women, or is there a place of women in the third world? And sitting on this dais of 10 grey men, or greying men, I am somewhat apologetic and sheepish, as you can understand. Now, certainly I cannot rectify that situation here, but I do think that there is a certain way in which our discourse also gets inflected by our being men, being in power, being the staff of power, thinking like the nation state or thinking like the state. So at some level, I do want to sort of also distance myself from some of the things which have been said today and yesterday, Jomo had actually thrown some questions at me, which he knew I couldn't answer then. So, but I won't go into answering those. My point simply would be to reiterate that there is something about our thinking about capital and our thinking about the economy, the thinking about BRICS and the Asian Development Bank and the game changers and so on, where the assumption, the happy assumption is always maintained. Capitalism is the phallus, and non-capitalism is the lack. Non-capital is the lack. And everything that is not capital actually suffers from this penis envy of the lack of wanting to develop exactly the kind of stuff they have. And I think much of our discourse, in fact, when yesterday Jomo was talking about Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals and so on, he was in fact expressing also a skepticism of a long-standing skepticism that we in India have been expressing about something like mega dams, for example. So there is a way in which much of our phallus envy, penis envy, and our phallocentrism in the domain of economy ultimately boils down to saying we must also have it. And therefore, at some level, the question with which Jomo actually began was the larger question of climate change and ecology, global warming, and so on, neatly got pushed aside because ultimately the question is we must also have it. And how do we have it without big dams and without other stuff and so on? So my question then is, and actually when I was listening to Yan Haoring yesterday about the nature of Chinese in Africa, in parts of Africa where she's been doing her research, I couldn't really think of those trading families or family businesses as capital. You know? There is something wrong in subsuming everything under this large rubric called capital and capitalism and Chinese capital and so on and so forth. And so I would like to mark my distinction here by simply making this, bringing into this picture what two feminist scholars, Julia Graham and Catherine Gibson did, which was called queering capitalism, basically by saying that just like there is no normed heterosexual body, there is no polarity of the sexed male and female body, and that there are actually a range of intermediate bodies, that male bodies have female chromosomes and characteristics, and there are men who have breasts, there are women who have mustaches, and so on and so forth. And so, likewise, this whole business of producing a pure capitalism, which apparently has nothing, and on the other hand, everything that is not capital is the story of a lack, is something I want to actually reiterate, especially because there cannot be a new Bandung with mega dams. There cannot be a new third world solidarity with mega dams and industrialization and so on and so forth. The story has to change, and that story cannot change without first changing the story of capital itself.
Thank you, Aditya, for inspiring me with that Freudian reading of capital. And I think to follow on that, there is this Zizekian take on this, the fear of castration, right? And it's very strong. In social movements, they want to be part of that. There is this strong fear of castration, of not being part of that capitalist development. They want to control, they want to speed up so they can catch up. And I think this is the spirit of the Bandung meeting that we have today. Not 60 years ago, but today in Bandung. I sent a message after our forum yesterday to one of the secretaries of the new president and asked what is the main message and what is new? What is Indonesia going to do in the new forum? And the reply was that they want to have speeches that will be more than business as usual. A really strong message, particularly a message about new governance and global justice. So sending a new message, more speeches, that sounds business as usual to me. Yeah. But of course there is hope always, and I think this is what I'm going to sort of reflect on. I started with a pessimistic note, but this is a Gramscian pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So, and three areas that I'd like to focus on. The first is this idea of having an Asian, African, Latin American ground for economic cooperation. What does it actually mean? I mean, the idea now there is this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Everybody wants to be part of that, except for the United States. Britain is already in, Australia is, and they are sort of like moving up. But what I'm more interested in is that what will it do? Like what kind of services does it provide, and how is it different from all the banks that we have already? I'm not only talking about national policies, but really talking about what is happening on the ground. For example, in Indonesia, there is this new obsession with building a maritime axis, Indonesia to become a world maritime axis. Basically, what it means to many of us is that build new ports, massive displacement of people, and then also domination of big powers in the fishery industry. So what I'm trying to say here is that in order to really understand the dynamics, we need to sort of map out all these new initiatives are taking place right now. And from my understanding, even in this forum, we have little understanding about that. We may know something about the great arrangements, what capital is trying to do and how the international scene is changing, but how does it really affect our landscape? And this is an important issue that I think needs to be addressed even more in our future forums. The second one is about the nation state. It has been raised like several times, and I do agree with Professor MAMDANI when he said that we cannot do without a state. And this is an ongoing discussion in Indonesia as well, whether social movements should connect or ally themselves with the state or not. And there's been constant, like I think Latin America and everywhere we have that kind of discussion. But in Indonesia there is an interesting context with the rise of this new government, with the president of having no political background, with only slight connection with the old oligarchy. And is there hope of getting yourself involved in the process of state making? And this is also related to the whole question of redefining the Indonesian nation. Indonesia has been under a dictatorship for 32 years. And people of my generation, I was born in the late 1960s, lost our faith in the national project. We lost our faith in state projects. We tended not to believe in everything official, etc. And we wanted to create something new. And of course it was hard, it is still hard now. But now comes the opportunity that you can actually sort of get yourself involved in that process that you hated. And it's really difficult, even for me, to have friends, say, on the other side, and how to communicate and how to build a new sort of understanding of the situation, and get yourself involved in discussions about Asia, Africa. It's also an interesting part. I've spent the whole week before coming here having that kind of discussion. And I think the redefining the state redefining the nation and the connections between the two is an urgent task for Indonesia, but I assume for other places in the region as well. Yeah, to have a clearer understanding of what role you can play in the new arrangements. And the last issue is about how to proceed. Again, Professor MAMDANI reminded we are not a state. So many people here are public intellectuals, academics, activists. And I think one way to proceed is to pursue the initiatives that InterAsia has been taking for more than a decade now. Yeah? It has been trying to open up platforms for discussion, InterAsia, but now having this conference on Asian, African, and also Latin America, I think we should also think about expanding this network, Codestria, Third World Network, and all these different platforms that you have. I mean, it's interesting if you remember that back in the 1980s, the connection was there. So one thing to restart a new conversation is to understand also why did it disconnect and how. I'm also part of ARENA. There's another sort of network of activists, scholars, but it's also sort of waned a little bit. No, it lost its initial energy, and we need kind of answer to that, like why all these initiatives fail to inspire. And one of the reasons probably, and this is because there are so many young students here, is the lack of new energy. And in responding to Aditya's comment, also the lack of gender balance in the conversations. I mean, migrants are missing from the discussions. Although migrants are really, I think, a typical today an important figure in the economy, in social life. I mean, there have been studies conducted about the effect that Filipino maids may have on Hong Kongese children, because there are so many being brought up and also taken care of by these Filipino maids. The effects in Europe has been already studied, and there are some interesting findings that come up. So they are everywhere: economic, social life, and also cultural life. And the second one is the inclusion of a new generation of scholars, activists, who have built different platforms, but not in a conference form like this, but the use of new media. They've been talking. I mean, I was really impressed by the transcription of Samir Amin's speech in the first day. No? And here you have younger people experimenting with all this. But my feeling is that they have not been really included in the discussions that we are trying to sort of pursue. And once you have that kind of new energy involved in this, I'm more hopeful about the future.
关心我说几句哈，因为刚才我们的所有的主讲嘉宾呢，每个人说过来，我刚才就一直在想，就是万隆会议离今天已经60年，那么60年之后的世界会怎么样？就我们今天看万隆的时候呢，很多事情都已经改变了，但是呢，从今天开始60年之后，后面的人会怎么样来看待我们今天的意见，我们今天的观点，我们今天讨论的一些主题，我们的思维方法。那么这一次跟60年前相比啊，所幸我们邀请了一位来自拉美的客人。跟当年的万隆的状态，亚非之间的状态不一样。当年的是一个 就是这种所谓的官方说法是第一次没有西方在场的一次这种亚非的这样一个新兴独立国家的一个大会，但是实际上在那场会议上面，西方当然在场，西方当然在场。实质上那个会议相当大的一个意义是给西方看的。那么今天的情况呢？今年年初，我邀请一个法国学者，一个法国哲学家，来学校来做讲演，就 Bernard Stiegler。我跟他介绍今天这个会的时候，他的第一个问题就是希腊在不在第三世界里面？就在今天，希腊在不在第三世界？包括当年的那些殖民者，当年那些殖民者，像无论是西班牙还是葡萄牙，在今天他们如果用联合国的指数，他们是在第几世界？他们是在一种什么状态？我这个没有任何别的意思，而是说我回想起，2008年我们在做一个展览的时候呢，当时有一位越南裔的，现在在 Berkeley 的一个教授，一个艺术家，他当时说的一个观点，就是说在今天或许我们第一世界、第三世界呢，很难像以前那样去区分。或许我们一个很重要的任务呢，是从第一中发现第三，从第三中发现第一。当然，我不完全认同这位叫崔明哈的艺术家的观点，但是呢，我想起白永瑞先生的前辈，另外一位姓白的教授，也是我们亚际书院的顾问之一，白乐晴先生的一个观点。白乐晴先生的一个重要的观点是在70年代提出来的。他说，今天我们讨论第三世界，并不是为了把世界一分为三，相反呢，是为了统合为一。他的意思是说，我们不止，这是我的理解，就是我们不管是东方还是西方，南方还是北方，其实我们应该在全球的范围之内，超越这个东西南北这样的一些部族化的对立或者阵营的，我们常常说阵营，这种超越这些阵营，来重新来去串联，去建构一个属于所有的民众的这个第三世界，就一个民众的世界。那么这是一个很典型的，在70年代还会有的一种国际主义，一种团结的思想。那么在今天有没有可能？今天我们常常在说 global local， 多大程度上，当我们讨论 local 的时候，这个 local 这个在地是被分配的在地，是被分割的在地。就它不是说我们自己构造出来，而是说它是被分配的。就是这样，同样在民族国家的形状上也是一样。我们看一下世界地图，非洲的那个国界横平竖直，也就是这个框架是我们的殖民经验之一，殖民的体系之一。所以说，在很多这种情况下，就是我们在今天去思考第三世界，可能跟60年前那批新鲜的立国者们思考是完全不同的。那么在这里面还有一个问题，就是说，既然情况完全变化了，那么我们今天去纪念万隆，去复兴万隆的精神，可能如果是把万隆精神原样的搬到今天是没有用的。就那个时候能够形成的团结，在今天可能只能导致的是分而治之的这个全球资本主义的这个分而治之的这种竞争关系。我们中国和印度就典型是这样，那么就变成了一个竞争的关系，变成了互相的某种意义上竞争者，做不成兄弟。但是还有一个，那么这就要求我们就在今天的这个新的现实里面呢，去重新发明、重新创造出新的万隆精神。那么这是什么？我们的依据是什么？它的内核，重新串联、重新团结的这个内核，它的依据又是什么？ 这是我希望向诸位前辈请教的。
As moderator of the panel, I should open it for question, but I thought I have some sort of compelling things to say. Almost like a confession mode. But when we started organizing this serious event, for me personally, I know it's going to be a learning journey. All right? I literally mean learning. Right? And I also brought 2 of my MA students here for them to learn. Right? And so what do I mean by that? I think in a way, you can remove the entire, or you can debunk, or say Bandung is completely out of the mode. Right? For me, it's still one very, very small, not small, big challenge. Right? And yesterday, like Zhang Ziqiang was talking about these, what is at least the legacy of the Bandung, not only for the state, but for the intellectual imagination. And I, very, very simple, in Chinese term, abbreviated as Ya Fei La, meaning Asia, Africa, and Latin America, all right? So that was the articulation, at least forcing a lot of project going, in the sense that, I want to say, when everything is said, on the level of the intellectual knowledge, at least most of us are working with, that project is still incomplete. Like, I think Sam pointed that we don't know each other's background and so on, right? So for us, it is a tremendous learning process, even get these heavy-duty reader, right? What do I mean by that? It is through reading this material, through Sam, I began to enter Africa, began to know something about Africa, began to know something about Jamaica, which I know a little bit. The same thing with Roberto, right? Or Mahmood. This through their writing, we begin to learn something. I kind of, how should I say, I don't want to, there's no proud in this. I guess I'm one of the Pan-Asian. So I know something about South Asia. I know something about, Southeast Asia. I spent 2 years living there, Indonesia, Malaysia. I know a little bit. I position sort of living in the Northeast Asia end. I know something, right? But so when we articulate, even we call the I want to let you know, I think all of you would know, when we started the Inter-Asia process, there was no basis, no interaction, even among our neighborhood, right? So we've centered on the level of knowledge, in the sense that we know that knowledge pointing to much larger, not only geopolitics, but how knowledge gets produced. What are the material conditions within which knowledge gets produced? So in that sense, that still, through this process, we begin to learn something, right? So in that sense, we, sort of pointedly, to invite people like Rupert to come, right? We know Caribbean is a very important space, generating interesting intellectual work and so on, but it has been ignored in the region. So in that sense, it is, in a way, when we say that's, when we first articulated the notion of Asia, that at the same time already implied the existence of Latin America and Africa, right? But without this inter-Asia networking process for the past 15 years, we will not be able to arrive at this point, at least for my generation, right? Jomo is, I think, is an earlier one. They have an entire network in place, or much more solid than we did. And Southeast Asia has a much more solid, earlier network among the social sciences and so on. And even Northeast Asia has a common sort of script, or more similar script embedded. There was no, partly because of the Cold War, of course, right? So in that sense, it is an incomplete project to be, unless somebody tells me it's irrelevant, right? Excellency or relevance. Unless you want to say it's irrelevant to pursue this, we have certain stubbornness in our bone or heart. This is the line we have to go on pursuing, right? That was the difficulty with listening to Aditya yesterday for most of us, because we don't know enough about the Indian intellectual formation within South Asia. We begin to know a little bit through subaltern study, right? And so on and so forth. And I heard the story when organizing this with our friend, Tejaswini Niranjana, a feminist close ally. She's supposed to be sitting here, but because of visa problem and so on. And Interasia actually has a very large feminist presence, also queer and Marxist and all these intermingling. But Teju told me a story. I didn't want to say this, but somehow I feel maybe this is also the moment to say this again. Teju said in 1990 in Jamaica, she and David Scott, who's the editor of the Small X, and Mahmood, they met in 1990. They were talking about imagining to set up a institutional space for these different, sort of knowledge producer to come together, right, to interact with each other. But that dream didn't come true. I don't know whether Mahmood this was true or something, but I still think that call is still there. Tell me one single institution, put that on the table, materialize, right? But I think this is a different moment. In the 90s or even, during the Bandung moment, you rely on the state. But whether we can do it now, right? Some of us control certain very small institutions. Control is probably not the right word. We occupy certain spaces, right? And whether that possibility is there with the CSDS or Makerere Institute for Social, Research and so on. We all have a little bit. Interasia, project constructed a consortium of friends institution to produce at least this very, very small thing like summer school. But I think we need something much more systematic and let our next generation at least to read the work for among the younger generation, also among those who have produced interesting and useful work. Right. I think that, for me, Bandung is still there in the sense that it's not yet complete, right? So when we talk about Asia, we always have to have in mind there's always something larger, right? Spaces out there. We're so ignorant. Right? So I guess that's in a way, I want to take it back to, for some of us working with the Interasia School. But when you mention Codesria, it's actually a huge burden. We are very, very small pocket. Codesria for us is like this giant, equipped with all these also 30, 40 years of work already maintained there, right? But how do we, not only that, Latin American has its own council, but now Arabic has its own Arabic Council of Social Sciences 3 years ago established. So these are the, I think, larger projects which we cannot work with. But we need to have the sort of at least some small vision and say we need to, this is how we position ourselves in that sense, in relation to these smaller ones and bigger ones. But one last thing I want to say, and I need to change my tongue to Mandarin again, that was, again, follow from Mahmood, but also Jomo's question, how does China position itself? And let me limit my space, to displace the term China with Chinese intellectual. I think that's the challenge. 所以我大概我必须要用中文讲，所以我想要讲的是说，那个Jomo刚才在讲的就是说，中国到底怎么摆放自己，他自己怎么看自己的位置，那个我没有能力做分析。可是我觉得我好像还有那个权利或能力讲几句话的是说，那所谓中国知识分子怎么摆放自己，而不是中国，啊。所以也就是说，到底把自己摆到一个什么位置去，来定位自己，啊。那所以在这个时候，就是说，假如其实这个不是一个新的东西了。假如把中国知识分子，这是一个真实的经验。其实第三世界的知识分子非常非常希望跟中国的知识分子交往，可是我必须要讲，后来弄到后来，对于第三世界感兴趣的很多人都坐在这个房间里了。那有很多人那个对第三世界的事物也好，知识世界的那个互动不感兴趣，啊，那你也不能要求强迫别人，这个不是一个政治正确的年代了嘛。那怎么样把，就是说最起码感兴趣的人，大家还可以一起工作吧？那这样子来定位我们自己，也就是说，中国的知识分子是第三世界知识分子的一个构成嘛？这好像是一个很简单的事情，还不要讲说未来。我觉得那个未来世界的想象，小明讲的事情我完全同意，但是问题是我们没有好的分析，我们大概知道这个好的世界应该会是什么样子。可是那个昨天我已经在讲这个问题，就是说，那个对于整个世界未来的想象，是要透过跟在座的这些人的互动去了解不同的地方。这个没有叫什么？没有高铁可以坐，也没有喷射机可以坐，那必须要进到这些阅读里面，要把自己的身体摆在东西里面，我们才可能开始慢慢能够进行分析。所以讲粗暴一点，就是其实不只是那个亚际的同仁们，在座的朋友一样，我们大家必须携手合作，投入到这一个互动的过程，才可能去找到一些未来，在分析以后，才能够提出来未来的世界会是什么样子的。要不然的话，我们还是坐在这里，对不对？作为中国人，我认为世界该是什么样的？啊，大概我觉得这个做不到的，啊。那所以这一个东西，我大概这样讲的意思，也就是说，那个其实不只是中国人，我昨天一直在讲，包括在座的白永瑞兄这些人，你知道，大概是我们属于同一个结构里的，啊，大家要一起来合作。所以我是说，那个有西米也逃不掉，啊，NIGAM也逃不掉，CHEN也逃不掉的。这个不是只是一个中国人的问题，是所有人要在这个里面。可是我觉得很关键的，可以做的，我觉得我们可以做的是在知识上，啊，那个慢慢去多读一些别人的东西，啊，然后去了解别人的状况，我觉得才能够提炼出来好的分析，然后才能够去转化我们自己的知识的这些可能性。所以我觉得这个东西是万隆一直到现在对我们最大的对做知识工作的人的最大的挑战，啊，所以我们没有办法讲的那么大，说这个世界要怎么，因为那个工作我们都还没做，啊，那既有的知识出了很多的这些问题，那必须就像今天一直在谈的知识的脱殖民问题、去殖民问题，在太多的层次操作，我们其实都没有答案，可是我们知道既有的东西走不下去了，所以才想要找不同的这些出路吧。那我其实不应该讲那么多话的，可是这个大概是心里面想讲的话，正好很多人都坐在这里，特别是我觉得年轻的一代的一些朋友们，啊，所以我应该要闭嘴了。所以现在把那个场开放给在场的所有的人，好吗？